My name is Ana Mendez, age 31, and this happened in late October near Lake Placid, in the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York. I remember the weekend with a clarity that sometimes frightens me, because nothing in my life before or since has ever seemed so brutally real. I have camped many times, driven my RV into quiet corners of the world, and slept beneath unfamiliar constellations. But I can never forget what happened on that particular trip. This is my account, as honest and detailed as I can make it. It was supposed to be a weekend escape, just me and my two close friends, Mark and Jade. We'd all been working hard that year, too hard really, and I thought a few days off the grid would do us good. We all lived in New York City, caught up in the hum of subways and the glare of screens. Mark, age 33, was my closest friend since college, sarcastic, skeptical, and proud of his so-called no-nonsense approach to life. Jade, 27, was a newer friend, an anxious soul who loved nature's beauty but worried about its unpredictability. And I was in between them, steady Anna, the unofficial mediator who always tried to keep the peace. We decided on the Adirondacks, a remote RV campground not far from Lake Placid. It was late autumn, just before the first snow. The leaves had mostly fallen, leaving tall pines and skeletal branches that rattled in the breeze. I drove my old RV, a 1990s model with chipped paint and a finicky generator, into a campsite I'd discovered on a previous trip. It was off the beaten path, down a gravel road that few tourists seem to know about. Perfect for peace and quiet, I'd thought. Perfect for disconnecting from everything. We arrived around midday, the sun sinking behind layered ridges. The spot I chose had a small clearing, just enough room for the RV and a makeshift fire ring left by previous campers. The forest pressed close on all sides. Mossy logs, carpeted pine needles, distant hints of a lake we couldn't quite see. It was beautiful and still. Our first annoyance came when I tried to fire up the RV's generator to get some heat and lights inside. It sputtered and died after a minute. Mark shrugged and said, "We don't need power. We're here to rough it, right?" Jade just frowned, hugging herself against the chill. I said nothing and tried again. Eventually, the generator gave a weak hum, but I knew it wouldn't last long. Our portable radio also crackled with static. No emergency signal, no music, just a thin buzz. My flashlight beam was weak too, the batteries draining faster than I'd ever seen. Still, we tried to enjoy ourselves. We built a small fire, roasted marshmallows. Mark told a few jokes at Jade's expense, teasing her about jumping at every sound, but I told him to back off. "We're here to relax," I said. "Let's just enjoy the calm." He rolled his eyes, but obliged. As dusk settled, Jade asked, "Do you guys see that?" She pointed at the ground a few yards behind the RV. I grabbed a flashlight and knelt beside footprints pressed into the damp earth. They were odd, longer than a human foot, toes too elongated, the impression too deep. Maybe it was a trick of the light, but I couldn't categorize them as bear or deer. Mark laughed it off. "Probably just a weird boot print," he said, though no one else had been around for miles. Jade looked unsettled, and I tried to soothe her. "We're in the wild. Tracks can look strange. Don't worry." We settled in for the night. Inside the cramped RV, the three of us shuffled bedding and sleeping bags. I got the short end of the deal, the narrow bench seat, but I didn't complain. The forest outside was quiet, except for the occasional breeze. Around midnight, I woke to a faint noise, whispers, like voices carried from a distance. At first, I thought I was dreaming. I listened, heart thudding, and realized I couldn't make out words, only the vague cadence of someone calling. The voice sounded eerily familiar, almost like someone imitating my own voice. I sat up, shivering, but when I peered through the window, I saw nothing. Just dark silhouettes of pines. In the morning, Jade's flashlight was missing. She swore she left it by her sleeping bag, but now it was gone. We found it eventually, but not inside the RV. It dangled from a tree branch, 6 feet above our heads, as if carefully placed there. Mark insisted it must have been Jade's doing, maybe in her sleep, but she looked so frightened and confused that I believed her. I certainly hadn't moved it, and I didn't think Mark would pull such a cruel prank. The second evening brought more tension. The generator died completely, leaving us with only headlamps and the campfire's glow. Mark and Jade argued over leaving right then and there. Jade wanted to pack up and find a proper campground. Mark accused her of being paranoid. I tried to reason with them. We're fine, we just need to stay calm. But their raised voices soured the atmosphere. While they bickered, I stepped away to breathe. As I circled the RV, the hair on my neck prickled. There were more footprints, these circling the RV in a deliberate pattern. Some were pressed deep, some lighter, as if something had danced around our campsite during the night. I swallowed hard and told myself it was just an animal, but deep down, I felt fear coiling in my gut. After dark, the forest's silence became heavy. No birds, no rustling deer, nothing. When Jade stepped outside for some air, I followed and stood by her shoulder. That's when we heard the whispers again, voices drifting between the trunks. They were clearer now, sometimes calling my name. Anna, in a voice like my mother's. I hadn't heard my mother's voice in that tone in years. I snapped my head around, half expecting to see her. Jade clung to my arm, whispering, "What is that?" And I had no answer. Then, just beyond the campfire's glow, we saw something move. At first, I thought it was a branch bending in the wind, but it had a shape, taller than a man, with limbs that bent at unsettling angles. The figure disappeared behind a pine before I could focus on details. Jade trembled. "There's someone out there." I nodded, heart pounding. Mark came out, annoyed. "What's going on?" We shushed him and pointed. He claimed to see nothing. We spent that night barricaded inside the RV, doors locked. The walls were thin, and I could hear faint scratches along the aluminum siding, as if fingernails gently testing its strength. Mark pressed his ear to the wall and shook his head, pale but determined to deny the impossible. Jade began to cry softly, and I sat beside her, arms around her shoulders, trying to calm her. The voice, my own voice, whispered from outside, "Anna, help. Help me." I couldn't block it out. At dawn, the scratches were visible, deep, ragged marks scoring one side of the RV. Nothing had broken in, but something had certainly tried. Our lawn chairs, carefully folded beside the door, were arranged in a circle facing inward, as if to watch some invisible performance. A water canteen was gone. More footprints in the dirt. Mark's skepticism showed cracks now. He looked troubled, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting to see someone standing there. We had to decide what to do. The RV's tires looked scuffed, and I worried about them being damaged. We agreed to leave, but when I tried starting the engine, it sputtered and died. I popped the hood and found strange, oily residue smeared over some parts. Without tools or a proper mechanic, I wasn't sure if we could fix it. "We'll have to leave on foot," I said, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. Jade's face contorted with fear. Hiking out in these woods, with something lurking around, was the last thing she wanted. But we had no choice. We packed quickly, each shouldering a backpack. Mark insisted on taking more supplies, but Jade panicked. "We can't carry too much. We need to move fast." They argued again, and I had to step in. "We get only what's essential. Water, flashlights, first aid. Forget the rest." They nodded, subdued by the gravity of our situation. Just as we stepped away from the RV, we heard a low, guttural sound from the trees. I spun around, heart hammering. Among the pines, half hidden by shadows, stood the thing we had glimpsed before. It looked human, and not human at once. Too tall, bones pressing against taut grayish skin, limbs too long for its torso. Its eyes were hollowed recesses, yet I felt them fixed on us. It let out a soft clicking sound. We froze. I thought of old legends my grandfather had told me, stories of wendigos in the cold northern forests. He used to say that these creatures were once human, twisted by hunger and madness into something monstrous. They stalked isolated travelers, mimicking voices, drawing people off their path. I'd always thought of them as fairy tales. Now I wasn't so sure. Without a word, we began to walk away from the campsite, along the gravel road that had led us here. We moved in a tight group, shoulders touching. The morning light was weak, the sky overcast, making the forest gloomier than it should have been. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made us flinch. As we trudged forward, the voices followed us. They whispered from behind trunks, called our names in tones that belonged to people we knew. Jade whimpered each time she heard them, tears wet on her cheeks. Mark's jaw was clenched so tight I thought he might break a tooth. I tried to keep them moving, one foot in front of the other, ignoring the impossible sounds. We pressed on for over an hour, but the road seemed endless. At one point, Mark stumbled. He cursed, struggling with the strap of his backpack, which had gotten twisted around his arm. "Hold on," he said. "I just need to fix this." Jade and I slowed, looking back at him. A branch snapped to our right. Before I knew what was happening, something blurred through the trees, faster than I could follow. Mark yelped, cut short as if the sound was snatched from his throat. I spun around and saw only the disturbed brush, a glimpse of something pale dragging Mark's form backward into the undergrowth. Mark's eyes were wide, and he reached a hand toward me. Then he vanished into a curtain of ferns and shadow. I screamed his name, but the forest swallowed it. Jade dropped her pack and would have run after him if I hadn't grabbed her wrist. She struggled against me, shouting, "We can't leave him!" I knew that chasing blindly would only get us both killed. Tears flooded my vision as I pulled her forward. "We have to go," I hissed, voice shaking. Jade sobbed, calling for Mark. "We can't leave," she cried, but my fear had calcified into grim determination. If we stayed, we'd die too. We ran. The forest seemed to close in, every direction identical. The road should have been here, but the path twisted, as if the landscape itself was shifting to confuse us. My heart pounded, lungs burned. Jade stumbled often, her tears blurring her vision. I tried to calm her, but I could barely calm myself. The creature's presence lingered behind us, a quiet menace. I heard the faintest echo of Mark's voice calling my name, but I refused to believe it. It was no longer Mark, just that thing, stealing his voice. It wanted to lure us back. It wouldn't get the chance. We pressed on until exhaustion forced us to slow. Eventually, we found a trail sign. The carved letters were faded, but read something like Ranger Station, Tu Tiao Mei. Relief and dread collided inside me. We had a direction now, a beacon of possible safety. Jade clung to my sleeve as if I were her lifeline. As we followed the signs, the creature harried us from the periphery, cracks of twigs, half-seen silhouettes dancing between trunks. I tried not to look too closely. The Adirondacks were supposed to be peaceful, a sanctuary of nature. Now it felt like a kingdom of nightmares. We forced ourselves onward, desperate for any sign of human presence. After what felt like hours, we spotted a clearing. There, half hidden behind a rise, was a small wooden structure, a ranger station or a maintenance cabin, something man-made. I almost wept with relief. The door was locked, but a window was cracked open. I boosted Jade inside, then hauled myself through. The interior smelled of old wood and dust. We found a radio on a shelf. I tried to switch it on, my hands trembling. Static hissed, then a garbled voice. I called for help, voice breaking, explaining something was out there. I'm not sure how coherent I sounded, but we were beyond dignity. Jade slumped into a corner, sobbing softly. I knelt beside her, hugging her tight. "We're safe now," I lied, hoping that the creature wouldn't dare come closer to this human refuge. Outside, the forest had grown silent again. Dawn's light was stronger, but still pale. I realized I had no idea how long we'd been running. We tried to explain what happened to the ranger who arrived an hour later. He was a young man with a puzzled frown, asking how we got there and what we'd seen. I described the footprints, the voices, the lanky shape in the woods. Jade only muttered about Mark's disappearance. The ranger's eyes went wide, skeptical. He said we must have encountered a bear or maybe a sick animal. We showed him the scratch marks on my jacket, the bruises on Jade's arms from my grip, and the panic in our eyes. He called for more help. Another ranger arrived, and a small search party went into the woods. Jade and I huddled by the station's wood stove, shaking from cold and shock. Hours passed. The searchers found no body, no monstrous footprints. They found our RV eventually, saw the claw marks on its side, the strange arrangement of chairs. They took photos, shook their heads. But no one found Mark, and no one could offer a sane explanation. We answered questions from the authorities, local police, a park official. They hinted that perhaps Mark wandered off in the night, got lost. Maybe a bear attacked him. They asked if we'd been drinking or using any substances. I insisted we had not. I struggled to convey the horror of it, the unnatural presence of something that shouldn't exist. Their sympathy was gentle, but incredulous. In the end, I left the Adirondacks with Jade, both of us hollowed by fear and grief. Mark remained a missing person. Without evidence, no one would ever label his disappearance as caused by something paranormal. He was just lost, another hiker tragedy in the vast wilderness. But I know what we saw. I know what took him. Jade moved away a few months later, unable to cope with the nightmares and the silence from law enforcement. I can't blame her. I tried to return to normal life, but I still wake at night, heart pounding, listening to the quiet hum of my apartment's radiator and feeling that same terrible hush from the forest. Sometimes I catch myself straining to hear whispers that I pray never come again. I've read more about the Adirondacks now, darker bits of folklore, hidden histories. The Wendigo is a tale born of desperation and cruelty, a spirit that preys on those who stray too far from safety, mimicking voices, feeding on fear. Some say it's just a story for scaring children. I know better. I tell you all this so you might believe me, or at least understand that sometimes what we call legends live and breathe among us, hidden by the shadows of old-growth forests and the silence between human footsteps. I was 31 years old that October. I had my life in order, a plan, friends I trusted, and a sense of rationality that had never been shaken. Now I know our senses can fail us, logic can falter, and what remains is raw terror, primal and unstoppable. If you ever find yourself in the Adirondacks, alone at dusk, with the trees closing in and the air turning cold, remember my words. Don't listen to the whispers. Don't let them lure you off the path. And if you see footprints that make no sense, if you hear your own voice calling to you from behind the pines, run. Run and don't look back. I still see Mark's hand reaching out in my dreams. That final plea as something I couldn't comprehend pulled him into darkness. I try to convince myself he didn't suffer long. But the truth is, I'll never know. That ignorance haunts me as fiercely as the creature's hollow eyes. I've considered many times what would have happened if we hadn't gone off the beaten track, if I hadn't insisted on a quiet, remote spot. Would things have been different if we'd chosen a popular campground teeming with other campers? Probably. But that's speculation I can't afford to dwell on. The choice was made, the path taken, and the darkness found us. Jade rarely talks about it now. We keep in touch with awkward phone calls and stunted emails. She moved closer to her family in Pennsylvania. I stayed in the city, immersing myself in work, pretending that routine could shield me. I never told my family the full truth, only that Mark got lost and we couldn't find him. He was always a risk-taker, they say. He was always stubborn. They try to fit the tragedy into the neat patterns of ordinary misfortune. I let them. How can I explain what I can't fully process myself? I can still smell that forest sometimes, the damp pine needles, the faint scent of decay that drifted in the cold night air. I remember the oily residue on the RV's engine, the greasy feeling on my fingertips as I tried to fix it. I remember the footprints. Not quite human, not quite animal. A hybrid impression in the mud that mocked classification. Before this, I considered myself open-minded, but not superstitious. I loved ghost stories, but filed them under imagination. Now I know there are things beyond our comfort zones, entities older and stranger than the world we define with science. They don't care whether we believe in them. They exist regardless, waiting in the shadows for the right moment to reveal themselves. In that forest, something alien and ravenous observed us, learned our names, our voices, our weaknesses. It toyed with our minds, sowed fear and confusion. Only when we tried to escape did it strike, making off with Mark, as if to prove its dominance. It never showed itself fully, never gave us a neat glimpse. Perhaps that's why it haunts me so deeply. Our minds crave understanding, and I have none. Only scraps and silhouettes. The ranger who helped us, I remember his name was Sawyer. He tried his best to be kind. He offered us hot tea and told us the search teams were trained and efficient. After they returned empty-handed, he said, "Sometimes out here people vanish. It's not common, but it happens." He offered no explanation beyond the mundane. Maybe he believed our story but didn't dare say so aloud. Maybe he thought acknowledging such a creature would break something fundamental in him. In the weeks following, I read about disappearances in the Adirondacks, hikers who never returned, campers whose campsites were found ransacked. Official reports blamed accidents, hypothermia, hidden ravines, and animal attacks. No one ever mentioned wendigos or forest spirits. Yet some personal accounts hinted at the supernatural, mentions of strange calls in the night, mysterious silhouettes. I realized we weren't the first to experience this, just another footnote in a long history of whispered horrors. Now the memory itself feels like a scar, a reminder to never underestimate the wilderness. Nature is not ours to control, and the old legends are not just bedtime stories. Some corners of the earth remain wild in ways we can't comprehend. The Adirondacks, for all their serene beauty, harbor ancient secrets. If you're reading this, consider it a warning. If my story makes you uneasy, good. It means you'll be cautious. If you find yourself under towering pines as twilight bleeds into night, if something calls your name in a voice you know but can't place, remember to stay calm and hold fast to reason, or run before reason becomes useless. Jade and I escaped, but not unharmed. We carry the weight of Mark's fate and the heavy knowledge that monsters exist, lurking at the edges of our mapped world. Those darkened forests near Lake Placid, where my RV still sits rotting with claw marks on its sides, remain a place of nightmares. Whether the creature still waits there, hungry and patient, I cannot say. I only know it's real, it's dangerous, and it's out there. And if I could rewind time, I'd choose a crowded RV park or a well-lit hotel over the quiet Adirondack backwoods. But hindsight is useless now. All I can do is share my testimony in hopes that others might heed the silent warnings. It happened to me, Ana Mendez, at age 31 on a quiet October weekend. Let that stand as proof enough. My name is Stephen Clark, age 42, and this happened in early spring near the Devil's Tombstone Campground in the Catskill Mountains of upstate New York. I want to be as clear as possible about what I experienced, because I'm still trying to understand it myself. Let me start at the beginning, so you can follow what led me to that old willow tree and what happened beneath its twisted branches. I arrived in the Catskills just after the last patches of snow had melted. The forests were waking up, delicate shoots pushing through damp earth, moss growing rich and green over boulders, and streams swollen with meltwater. I had come here alone in my RV, a somewhat battered old model I'd bought used. I'm a freelance nature photographer and writer, and I needed new material for a photo essay on early spring wildlife. In particular, I wanted shots of migrating birds and the fragile blossoms that appear when winter finally releases its grip. It was more than just work. I'd come to these mountains to clear my head after a personal rough patch, a divorce that left me feeling hollow, and the recent death of my father, whose absence still felt unreal. Nature had always been my refuge, and I hoped the quiet forests would give me the clarity I craved. I parked my RV in a secluded spot not far from Devil's Tombstone campground. It was off the main camping areas, a bit more remote than most visitors preferred, but that's exactly what I wanted: solitude and silence. The road to get there had been rutted and half frozen just a week prior, but now it was passable. As I stepped out, I inhaled the scent of wet leaves and thawed soil. Before settling in, I stopped by the visitors center to check on trail conditions. There I met an old man named Emil Morgan. He had grizzled hair and wore a tattered flannel jacket. When I mentioned where I intended to camp, he gave me a strange look. "You watch yourself out there," he said, leaning in too close. "Not all places are friendly. There's an old willow tree deep in that forest. A bad place, they say. Witches used to gather there once upon a time." I almost laughed, thinking he was spinning local folklore for my benefit. But his eyes were serious and pale. "Don't stay near that willow after dark," he warned in a hushed voice. They say the witches never truly left. I thanked him politely and tried to put it out of my mind. Local legends often color places like this. Besides, I didn't believe in witches. Still, his tone unsettled me. My next stop was the ranger station, where I met Ranger Miriam Hall, a woman in her early 30s, friendly but somewhat distant. She cautioned me about sticking to well-marked trails. "This time of year, the woods can be confusing," she said. "And be careful with your equipment. Batteries don't last as long in the chill." When I mentioned I'd be near the old willow, it was marked on my map as a notable landmark. She hesitated, then just said, "I've heard stories. Nothing to worry about, but don't wander off at night." Her eyes flicked away quickly, as if not wanting to say more. By late afternoon, I'd settled my RV into a small clearing. The forest was thick around me, beech and maple, branches bare but budding, and a single old willow with a trunk as wide as a car and gnarled limbs that stretched low to the ground. It looked ancient. Curious, I walked closer. The willow's bark was cracked and twisted, its roots half exposed. I snapped a few pictures, noting how unusual it looked amid the other trees. As dusk approached, I tried to ready my camera gear for the next morning's shoot. That's when I noticed the first annoyance. My main camera lens refused to focus properly, and my spare batteries drained alarmingly fast. I fiddled with it, blaming the cold or maybe some internal fault. Nothing seemed to fix the glitch. Frustrated, I told myself I'd use my backup lens tomorrow. With the sun dipping low, I decided to take a short walk before turning in. The ground was uneven, still slick in places, and at some point I stepped wrong and twisted my ankle. Pain flared, not severe but enough to make me limp. Cursing under my breath, I hobbled back to the RV. A minor setback, I thought. The ankle would slow me down but not stop me entirely. Night fell quietly. I lay in my RV bunk, the heater rattling a bit, making the interior smell faintly metallic. Just as I began drifting off, I realized how silent it was outside. Usually, even in early spring, you hear distant owls, rustling leaves, or small animals. Now, nothing. It was as if a blanket of hush had been laid over the forest. I told myself it was just a quiet night, nothing more. Around midnight, I jerked awake. High-pitched laughter drifted through the darkness. Faint, distant, yet unmistakably human-like. My heart thumped. I peered out the RV window, nothing but silhouettes of trees. Then it ceased. Could it have been wind through branches, playing tricks on my ears? Possibly. Still, I felt uneasy. I managed to fall asleep again, clutching my flashlight. Morning brought a thin haze of sunlight. I got up early to scout a good spot for photos. Before leaving, I noticed something odd. Around the campfire ring, in the damp soil, were strange symbols etched into the dirt. Rough circles, lines intersecting, a star-like pattern. I hadn't done that, and no one else was around. Maybe I hadn't noticed them yesterday. Maybe they were just old fire ring decorations, yet they looked fresh. My stomach tightened as I tried to shrug it off. Shaking my head, I limped into the woods with my camera. The forest felt wrong today. The birds that I'd expected to photograph, warblers, thrushes, were scarce. The few I spotted seemed skittish and quickly disappeared. After an hour, I realized that even the rustle of leaves was absent. I tried to follow a marked trail toward a stream, but my compass needle spun strangely, and my GPS lost signal. I cursed under my breath. Nothing technical seemed to work out here. Eventually, I found my way back by using the position of the sun and some basic trail markers. Back at camp, I decided to take a closer look at the old willow. Perhaps it was just curiosity, or maybe some compulsion I couldn't define. Leaning on my walking stick, a branch I'd whittled into shape, I approached the trunk. Beneath the mossy roots, I found small, childlike footprints in the mud. No children were camping nearby. I was sure of that. The footprints circled the tree as if some small feet had danced around it. I shuddered, remembering Emil Morgan's warning. That evening I tried once again to make radio contact with Ranger Hall, just to let someone know how strange things felt. The radio crackled, but all I got was static, punctuated by odd pops and clicks. No human voice responded. Just after sundown, as I boiled some water for tea, I heard that laughter again, closer this time, and mingled with low whispers. I stepped outside, flashlight in hand. The beam wavered over tree trunks, picking out rough bark and tangled roots. A shape flickered at the edge of my vision, pale, human-like forms, shifting among the shadows. When I turned the flashlight toward them, I saw nothing. But I could smell something like rotting leaves and old damp cloth. My heart pounded. I hurried back inside, locked the RV door, and tried to calm down. I told myself it was my imagination. I was stressed. And yet, the symbols, the footprints, the silence of the woods, and now these voices. I remembered what Emil Morgan had said, witches. Could these be spirits of old witches said to haunt the Catskills? Ridiculous, I told myself. But my pulse refused to slow. I barely slept that night. Around midnight, a tapping began on the RV's metal siding. Soft at first, then more insistent. I shut my eyes tight, holding my breath. When I finally dared look out the window, I saw a pale face peering in, gaunt, with eyes too bright. It vanished the second I screamed. Yes, I screamed. A raw, startled cry. At dawn, shaken and exhausted, I decided it was time to leave. I'd gather what I had, cut my trip short. No photograph was worth this creeping horror. Outside, the forest looked unchanged, but now I noticed that the etched symbols had multiplied, circling my RV. It was as if something had held a ritual around me while I slept fitfully inside. I tried starting the RV. The engine coughed and refused to catch. Opening the hood, I found an oily residue smeared on several components. My hands trembled. This was sabotage or something worse. Panicked, I packed a backpack with essentials, water, first aid kit, spare flashlight, and decided to hike out. I knew the general direction of the ranger station. Maybe I could find Miriam Hall or someone else who could help me. Limping through the forest, I tried to follow the path back to the main road. But the woods seemed altered. Trails I remembered now looped back toward that damned willow. My compass was useless. It spun as if near a magnet. The sun's position offered some guidance, but every turn led me back to familiar landmarks I swore I'd just passed. My frustration mounted, and with it came despair. The whispers started again. This time they called my name. Stephen. Stephen. In voices that sounded like my ex-wife's tone, or my father's gentle baritone, or even my own voice mocking me. I shouted for them to stop, tears of anger and fear burning in my eyes. The forest offered no mercy. I pressed on, determined. After what felt like hours, I stumbled onto a faint sign indicating a ranger station ahead. Relief washed over me. There was a faint path leading away. The problem was, each time I took a step, the laughter swelled. Branches scraped my jacket, leaving shallow scratches. I glimpsed ghostly shapes flitting behind the trees, thin figures draped in what looked like ragged cloaks, with faces obscured by shadows. They never confronted me directly, but their presence was everywhere. Nightfall approached again. I couldn't let it catch me lost here. With adrenaline pumping, I tried a different tactic. I would face the old willow head-on. The witches, if they were witches, seemed tied to it. If I could do something, anything, to break their hold, maybe I could escape. It sounded insane, but nothing else was working. I made my way back toward the willow. It wasn't hard. The forest almost led me there. The tree loomed large, its gnarled roots forming strange shapes like grasping fingers. The childlike footprints were gone now, replaced by a single line drawn in the mud, encircling the trunk. I remembered stories of appeasing spirits, of making offerings. I had little to give, but I pulled out my broken camera lens, my prized equipment now useless, and placed it at the base of the trunk. I then took out a photo I carried of my father, which I'd kept tucked in my wallet. Through tears, I spoke aloud. I know you're here. I don't know what you are, but I see your power. I acknowledge that I've brought my pain and loss into your woods. You're feeding on my fear, my sadness. I won't hide them. Here they are. My voice broke, echoing against the silent trees. For a moment, I felt foolish. But then the air changed. The whispers rose in a furious chorus, words indistinct but filled with anger. I caught sight of 3 pale figures emerging from behind the willow. Their forms shimmered as if seen through water. They were women, or something like women, with hollowed eyes and tangled hair. They hissed and reached with long, tapering fingers. I gripped a handful of dried herbs I'd collected earlier, just something to flavor tea. In desperation, I scattered them at the foot of the willow, a makeshift offering. I know I can't defeat you, I said, voice shaking, but I'm not running anymore. I have sorrow, yes. You can't use it against me if I don't deny it. The witches screamed, their forms flickering like candle flames in the wind. The chanting rose to a fever pitch, and I felt my head swim, knees buckling. But I stayed upright, determined. It felt like a test of wills. Then, suddenly, silence. The witches vanished, leaving only the soft sound of wind rustling new leaves. I blinked, heart hammering. The forest's hush lifted. Distant birds began to sing. When I looked down, my camera lens and the photo of my father remained untouched. I picked them up, tears still on my cheeks. With the witch's presence receding, the forest seemed normal again. I tried my compass once more. This time, it pointed north steadily. Following it, and the now familiar markers, I found my way toward the ranger station. It took me another hour, limping and exhausted, but no laughter followed me. No whispers taunted my name. Ranger Miriam Hall was surprised to see me stagger into the clearing near the station. She rushed over, her face pale. "Are you all right?" she asked. I must have looked wild-eyed and disheveled. I tried to explain what had happened, struggling to put it into words. I mentioned the witches, the strange footprints, the laughter. She listened quietly, then said in a low voice, "These woods have old stories. Most people don't see anything. You must have touched a nerve." I got the sense she believed me more than she let on, but perhaps feared speaking openly. She offered me tea and made a call to see if anyone could help retrieve my RV. I didn't argue. I felt hollowed out, relieved but shaken to my core. A few hours later, other rangers arrived. They found my RV in one piece, though the engine refused to start. No one commented on the strange residue or the symbols around the campsite. I collected my things and they towed the RV back to a main lot near the visitor center. I never saw Emil Morgan again, but I wondered what he'd say if I told him the full story. Perhaps he'd nod sadly, unsurprised. I left the Catskills the next day, with fewer photographs than I'd hoped. But I left with something else. A grim understanding that there are things in this world we can't rationalize away. The witches, if that's what they truly were, did not kill me, but they shook the foundations of my reality. They forced me to face my grief and vulnerability. In some bizarre way, confronting them allowed me to find a path out of their trap. As I drove away, sunlight cutting through the trees, I realized I'd never speak publicly of this. Who would believe me? The photos I took that weekend were mostly useless, blurry images, nothing supernatural. Yet I know what I saw. I know that some old legends linger like shadows among the trees, feeding on human emotions. Once home, I wrote down everything I remembered, just as I've told it now. Sometimes I wake at night, hearing faint laughter, or seeing flickers of movement at the edges of my vision. I wonder if the witches marked me somehow, leaving a subtle imprint on my psyche. Still, I survived. They showed me that my fears and sorrows weren't weaknesses to hide, but truths to accept. I never returned to that spot in the Catskills, and I never plan to. Let the old willow stand guard over its secrets. Let the witches whisper to the wind. I have my life to live, changed in ways small and large. The forest may have tried to claim me, but I refused to be lost. In that refusal, I found my escape. This happened to me, Stephen Clark, age 42, early spring in the Catskills. I record it here so that someone else might understand. If you ever find yourself wandering near a gnarled old willow tree, listen carefully. If laughter drifts on a windless night, if footprints appear where they shouldn't, if you feel the forest turning against you, remember my story. There are forces out there that thrive in silence and confusion. Your best chance, if you encounter them, might be to face them honestly, no matter how terrifying that may be. And if you cannot face them, then run. Run, and don't look back. My name is Adrian Moore, age 29, and this happened in late summer near Dry Creek Hollow in Allegheny State Park in southwestern New York. I'm laying it out as plainly as I can because even now, months later, I struggle to accept what I experienced. I was alone in my old RV, out there for field research, just a straightforward trip to gather data on nocturnal mammals, bats specifically, for my thesis. I never expected anything strange to occur, but nature, as I've learned, can be far stranger and more testing than textbooks or rational minds allow. I'm a graduate student in wildlife biology, and this was supposed to be the last push before my thesis defense. I'd done all the meticulous lab work and statistical modeling. I needed just a handful of nighttime recordings of local bat species, how they feed, what their echolocation calls reveal about their prey. The area around Allegheny State Park had always been known for healthy bat populations, and I'd chosen this spot near a dry creek bed known as Dry Creek Hollow for its relative isolation. Fewer campers meant less background noise, or so I thought. I remember arriving in the late afternoon, the air heavy and humid as if a thunderstorm were perpetually waiting on the horizon. My RV rattled over the narrow dirt road, past thick stands of oak and maple. I finally found a small clearing off the main track. The Dry Creek was just a shallow depression through the forest, now mostly mud and pebbles. But I knew from park literature that when storms hit, it could flood quickly. I just needed a few nights, I reasoned, and I'd be out of here. Stepping out, I took a deep breath of the forest air. Green, earthy, with a faint tang of decay. Late summer meant leaves still clung to branches, but the underbrush was thick and cicadas droned overhead. I set about organizing my gear: the ultrasonic detector for bat calls, camera traps for any night visitors, backup batteries, my field notebook, and a satellite phone just in case. The RV's small generator hummed at the back. I remember Ranger Dalton Kim stopping by not long after I arrived. He must have spotted the RV from one of the main trails. A broad-shouldered man with a weathered face, he greeted me politely and asked about my business. When I explained my research, he nodded thoughtfully. "Late summer's a tricky time. We've been getting these sudden storms at dusk," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "If you're near the dry creek, be careful. It can flood fast." I thanked him and mentioned I planned to stay only a few days. I sensed he wanted to say something else, but decided against it. He gave me a final look, a mixture of caution and mild concern, before disappearing back into the woods. That night, I set up my equipment. I wanted to record the bats' feeding buzzes, those rapid-fire echolocation calls they make right before catching insects. The detector worked fine at first, capturing a few faint chirps, but after an hour, the device began to malfunction. The signal wavered, and then the batteries, fresh from the pack, started to die unexpectedly. My camera trap's indicator light blinked erratically. I cursed under my breath. Nothing wrecks field research like faulty gear. Worse yet, a thunderhead rolled in as darkness fell. Wind rattled the RV's awning, and distant lightning flickered through the trees. I scrambled to protect my equipment. When I played back the short recordings I'd managed to get, I heard something strange mixed in with the bat calls, like a whisper or soft murmur, too low to interpret. Probably just interference, I told myself, or the detector picking up some odd echo. As I settled into my RV bunk, rain tapped on the metal roof. I tried not to worry. I'd do more recordings tomorrow. Closing my eyes, I drifted into an uneasy sleep. I woke at around 2 a.m., disoriented. Thunder rumbled closer. Stepping outside with a flashlight, I saw that the dry creek bed had a thin trickle of water now. The storm must have been heavier upstream. Then I noticed odd footprints near the water's edge. They looked human, barefoot, small, and spaced irregularly, appearing and then disappearing as if whoever made them had been walking on stepping stones of air. Confused, I knelt to examine them more closely. Rain blurred their edges. When the lightning flashed, I thought I saw a figure at the edge of my vision, maybe 20 yards away. A hunched shape in ragged clothes, half hidden behind the trunk of a hickory. I swung my flashlight around, but there was nothing there. A chill ran up my spine. I returned to the RV and locked the door, feeling foolish for my nerves. Probably a trick of the storm and my tired eyes. Still, I had trouble sleeping after that, listening to the rain and faint thunder. The next morning was muggy, the air thick as syrup. I tried contacting my grad advisor, Dr. Ellen Carter, on the satellite phone to report the equipment issues. The call hissed with static, and her voice came through distorted. I caught only fragments. Data. Need. Soon. Are you okay? Then it cut off. I cursed again. Nothing was working smoothly, and I had no idea why. Around midday, I took a short walk, careful to mark my path. The forest felt strangely subdued. No birdsong, no rustling animals. At one point, I rounded a bend and glimpsed movement ahead. That same ragged figure? This time I was sure I saw someone. A hunched form with what looked like tattered cloth hanging from the shoulders. But when I approached, there was only an empty patch of ferns. I called out, "Hello?" Silence answered. Returning to camp, I found the RV's interior hotter than an oven. My small fan refused to work, and the solar charger for my devices had drained instead of charged. Frustration gnawed at me. I decided to do what I came for, record bats after dusk, no matter what. I'd take notes by hand if I had to. That evening, the storms returned, as if on schedule. Dusk painted the forest in dim purples and grays, and thunderheads massed overhead. With my detector ready, I stood near the edge of the clearing, waiting for the bats. Sure enough, I heard their squeaks overhead and recorded what I could. Then, through the headphones, I heard something else. Soft laughter, like muffled chuckling, overlaying the bat calls. It was impossible, but I yanked the headphones off and stared into the dark. A flash of lightning revealed twisted branches and shifting shadows, but no human source. I tried to ignore it. The laughter had to be electronic distortion, right? The next hour was a nightmare. Trails I knew from my map started to seem unfamiliar. When I retreated a bit into the woods to place a camera trap on a tree, I got turned around. My compass spun uselessly, the needle drifting back and forth. My GPS showed nonsense coordinates. I tried to remain calm, retracing my steps. Every time the lightning flashed, I swore the landscape had changed. A fallen log previously on my right would vanish, and a large rock appeared where I knew there hadn't been one. That's when I heard whispering, distinct now, calling my name. Adrian. Adrian. The voice sounded eerily like Dr. Carter's, shifting pitch with the wind. Then, another voice, softer, taunted me about my upcoming thesis defense, asking if I had enough data, if I was sure I'd ever leave these woods with anything useful. My heart hammered. This was madness. I shouted back, "Stop it! Who's there?" But only thunder answered. I stumbled back to the RV, drenched in sweat, my head pounding. Inside, I fumbled for my radio. Static greeted me. I tried the satellite phone again, just a hiss and faint murmurs. As lightning strobed through the windows, I caught a glimpse of a pale face pressed to the glass, eyes wide and vacant, then gone in the next flash. I jumped up, flung open the door, but saw no one. That night, I hardly slept. The rain pounded relentlessly, and the dry creek began to fill with muddy water. I knew I had to leave, but in the darkness, with my equipment failing, it felt impossible. I promised myself I'd pack up at first light. Dawn brought no relief. The forest was still, and my gear was useless. The detector wouldn't even switch on. The batteries were drained again. My camera trap footage was corrupted. My compass remained unreliable. I tried memorizing the way out, followed the creek bed downstream until I hit the main trail. But after half an hour of limping through brush, I'd bruised my shin stumbling in the night. I ended up back at my RV. It was as if the forest looped in on itself. Fear and anger welled up. This place was toying with me. I recalled local folklore about Allegheny State Park, stories I'd overheard once in a diner near the area. People claimed strange vanishings occurred deep in the woods, rumored sightings of a frontiersman who'd vanished centuries ago. Some said his spirit lingered, leading travelers astray. Others whispered about a devilish presence that came with the storms. I had dismissed those stories before, but now, I wasn't so sure. After another futile attempt to find the trail, I returned panting and scratched by briars. I resolved to do something different. I'd confront this thing. It wanted me disoriented, afraid. The whispers feeding on my insecurities, my thesis, my future, suggested it thrived on fear and confusion. The next storm rolled in that evening. Standing outside the RV, drenched, I shouted into the darkness, "I know you're here! I know you're messing with me!" Lightning answered with a blinding flash. In the afterimage, I saw the hermit-like figure again, closer this time. The form seemed to shimmer, not quite substantial. It raised an arm and pointed toward the creek. Then it faded as thunder shook the ground. My heart thudded, but I refused to be led astray again. Instead of following that silent command, I stayed put. I decided to make a shelter under the RV's awning, to turn off all devices and just listen. If this presence fed on my panic, I'd offer none. If it tried to tempt me with illusions, I'd resist. Night fell hard. Rain battered the canopy, and the creek swelled louder. Dim lightning flashes revealed shifting silhouettes between the trees. I heard the voices again. "Adrian, can you finish what you started? Are you certain you have enough data?" A mocking laugh followed. I tightened my jaw and said nothing, focusing on my breathing. Hours passed. My legs cramped. My back ached. I wanted to run screaming into the night, but I forced myself still. Finally, The storm hit its peak. Sheets of rain lashed the clearing, and lightning stabbed down nearby. In that electric glow, I saw something pale and tall slip between the trunks. I saw runic symbols chalked onto wet rocks near the creek's edge, circles and strange angles that the rain couldn't wash away. I saw a faint bluish glow flicker and vanish. The whispers grew frantic, taunting my weaknesses. They mimicked Dr. Carter's voice, urging me to hurry and questioning my abilities. They took on my own voice, mocking my ambition, warning me I'd fail. I nearly broke, tears mixing with rain on my face, but then I remembered, I'm a scientist. Fear is just adrenaline. Confusion can be overcome. The forest might feel impossible now, but I would not give in to illusions. I'm scared, I said aloud, voice trembling. I admit that. I don't know what you are, but you won't make me lose myself. I took a shaky breath. I've worked too hard. I've come too far. A brilliant flash lit the hollow. The laughter ceased, replaced by a hiss like steam escaping a vent. The wind shifted. The raindrops slowed. For a moment, I saw the hermit-like figure once more. Now not threatening, but forlorn. It stood beneath a great oak, its edges blurring like a poorly tuned photograph. I realized it was no living man. Perhaps a phantom, a manifestation of this forest's strange power. It raised its hand in what looked like a sad salute, then faded into the gloom. The silence that followed felt enormous. The rain tapered to a gentle drizzle. My ears rang in the aftermath. I tried my compass again, and this time the needle pointed steadily north. Tentatively, I gathered my gear and checked the path. The creek bed, though still muddy, no longer seemed to shift. The stones were where they should be. The forest seemed to have settled into ordinary reality. At dawn, I hiked out. It took me far less time than I expected. Within an hour, I reached a recognizable trail sign. Another 30 minutes brought me to a main road where Ranger Kim found me. He rushed over, relief evident in his face. "We were starting to worry," he said. I could only nod. I knew better than to explain everything. What would I say? He drove me back toward the visitor's center. I retrieved my RV later with his help and a towing service. The engine started normally this time, no sabotage evident. Before I left, I tried calling Dr. Carter again. This time the call went through clearly. I told her I had some recordings but faced equipment trouble. She said, "Just do your best with what you have, Adrian." Her voice was calm, reassuring, nothing like the twisted version I'd heard in the woods. I drove home that afternoon, the sun high and warm. The sky was blue, no storms chasing me. I never told anyone about the whispers, the illusions, or the hermit figure. Who would believe it? Instead, I focused on what I learned, that I could stand up to fear, that I didn't need perfect data to defend my thesis, that I had more resilience than I'd given myself credit for. Weeks later, I successfully defended my thesis. My data set was smaller than I'd hoped, but I argued my case well enough. When the committee congratulated me, I almost laughed. They would never know the trial by storm and whisper that had tested my resolve in those remote woods. To this day, I'm unsure what I encountered. Was it some lingering spirit of the land? A trick of atmospheric conditions and my stressed mind? Or a guardian of the hollow, feeding on doubt and confusion? I've pondered it many times. Perhaps it doesn't matter. The forest gave me a lesson I didn't know I needed. Courage can be quiet, stubborn perseverance in the face of the unknown. I still recall those footprints by the creek, and the voice calling my name amid the bat calls. I'll always remember the sensation of reality twisting under lightning's glare. Yet I emerged not broken, but stronger. In the end, I escaped Dry Creek Hollow, and I kept my sense of self intact. If you ever find yourself alone in Allegheny's backwoods, pay attention. If your compass spins and voices mock you from the darkness, if a hunched figure beckons you deeper, remember my story. Something out there might test you. Whether it's a spirit or just your own psyche doesn't matter. Stand your ground. Face your fears. Only then can you find your way out when the forest tries to keep you lost. This happened to me, Adrian Moore, age 29, late summer in southwestern New York. Make of it what you will.